Hello friend, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a digital painting landscape tutorial. This painting has a lot of details and I'm super excited to share it with you, so please feel free to pause and pause often throughout the video. This tutorial will go quickly and we definitely have a lot to cover. This tutorial will be using the damp brush, and I will share my settings as well as the palette in just a moment. We will be using the soft airbrush as well as the light pen and the bokeh brush in the luminance section and the burnt tree brush from the charcoal section. If you wish to use your own brushes throughout the video, please feel free to. These are just my suggestions. Every new element we add to the painting will be put on a new layer until we merge it down. I've also included 3 breaks throughout the painting to stretch and regroup throughout the tutorial. Here's my palette. You can take a screenshot and transfer the colors onto your own palette to paint along with, which can be done by using the reference tool. Just transfer the photo into the reference and then drag and drop the colors into a new palette. These are the brush settings that I like to use. This is for the damp brush. If you don't want to use these settings, that is perfectly okay. The only thing I would recommend if you still want to use the damp brush is turning the grain source down to about 15 to 16%, the actual scale of it. That way it doesn't leave so many potholes in the painting and the blending. I wanted to add quickly, the inspiration for this scene comes from a classical music piece from a music group called Barrage entitled Mountain Spring, and I can't wait to paint this scene with you, so let's begin. So beginning with the lighter shade of cyan blue in its own layer, drop the color into the background, and then in a new layer take the darker shade of cyan blue and place it lightly over top of the middle and the top of the painting and lightly blend out. And then in a new layer with the darkest shade of blue, you will lay down color on the top and lightly blend from the top into the middle. So the next step is painting the clouds. In a new layer with the lightest cyan blue that's almost white, with a very light hand and medium-sized brush, with circular motion start sketching in the first layer of clouds and then lightly blend out. It helps to use a slightly circular scrubbing motion that goes upwards. That'll help really create a nice fluffy cloud. The next thing we'll be doing is adding another layer and repeating this step with a slightly smaller brush and then blending out. I'm really liking creating these tutorials with the Screen Record app. That way you guys can see approximately what size brush and opacity I'm using, because most likely, unfortunately, I will forget it as much as I try. And we're just lightly blending all of these areas in with a very light hand. And I definitely think I want to create a how to paint clouds tutorial soon. What do you guys think? Let me know below. So next we will be painting the mountains. So taking the darkest shade of blue with the soft airbrush tool, we will begin to lay down the color in a triangular shape on the left side and then lightly blend it out with about 50 to 60% opacity, and then using the soft airbrush with the eraser, carve the edges of the mountain. That way we create a sharper edge. So the next thing we're going to be doing is duplicating this layer, flipping it horizontally and moving it to the other side. And we're going to be carving a slightly different shape on the edge just to make it slightly different from the other side. We're going to merge those 2 layers down, and then you will see me refine both of them just a little bit more. In a new layer, using that bright white color, we will lay down a layer of white over top of the mountains and lightly blend them out to create the illusion of clouds over the mountains. When you're happy with the blending, we'll move on to the main mountain. So for the first part of this new mountain in front, we will basically just be repeating what we just did with the mountains behind it. That same darker shade of blue, we will sketch in that new like scraggly pyramid shape, lightly blending that out around the edges and then re-refining with the eraser tool to create a sharp edge, and we're going to lightly blend out the bottom. Feel free to pause the video at any time to catch up. Next, we're going to put down the first layer of snow, and we're going to begin with that same color of white on a new layer, and keeping all of the snow going in the same brushstroke direction, begin with a light hand laying that color down. I also moved my mountain just a moment ago just to move it a little closer to the center of the painting. So basically, we are focusing most of the bright white towards the top where the light is going to be hitting the top of the mountain, and then letting it really diffuse and fade towards the bottom. And as soon as you're happy with the amount of snow you have, with a smaller brush and low opacity, begin to blend it out. After you're happy with the blending of the snow, we will take the dark beige color in the second row on the far right and lightly sketch in the shadow side of the mountain and then lightly blend. I decided my layer was a little bit too bright too, so I turned down the brightness a little bit, and you'll see that here in just a moment. We're going to do a second layer of snow in a new layer. We're just going to be enhancing with that same shade of white the highlights we just created, and then lightly blending those out. It really helped me in this section to vary the line weight too when I was blending to really help mimic the texture of snow. So here's where I am still testing out different brush textures, and so far this is the one that I'm the happiest with. Using the burnt tree brush from the charcoal section and a very light hand and a small brush, in a new layer, sketch over the top of the mountain of the snow areas to create a minimal amount of texture. And then with a larger size brush and a lower opacity, very lightly blend those areas out. And by using the damp brush over the charcoal brush, it really helps to make the whole painting look a little bit more cohesive, and it kind of gets rid of some of the graininess from that charcoal texture. But I really like the texture it leaves behind. So here I'm duplicating that snow layer just to make it a little bit brighter. And then I'm going to take that same shade of beige that we used in the shadowed areas and lightly sketch in that snow texture over the shadows. I used mine on a different layer and made mine a little bit darker, and then we're just going to lightly blend those areas out. You're going to merge all of those layers down and then just lightly blend out the bottom. And here you'll see me just adding a little bit more detail. And here I'm lightly blending out the bottom. So we're about to start the next step. In a new layer, using the damp brush again, lay down that bright white color over the top of the mountain and the sides and lightly blend out, creating a puffy cloud effect over the top of the mountain. And that'll really help to add a lot of depth to the mountain. It'll help make it recede into the background a little bit more. So you'll see me here using the eraser tool with the soft airbrush and lightly just making the edges of the mountain a little bit more craggy. That way it's not so smooth. And we're just finishing up this section. So we have officially reached part 2 of this tutorial. So please feel free to pause and catch up, or just to take a break. And we will begin part 2 here in just a moment. So in a new layer with the dark shade of green, that is the lighter of the two, begin to lay down the color with the soft airbrush from the middle of the image to the very bottom. Using the damp brush, using the same shade of green on the same layer, we will use that shade of green to start creating the trees that run in front of the mountaintop. This requires a very light hand, and you're going to create short, flick of the wrist upward strokes to create those trees. We will create the trees along the entire length of the image, and when you're happy with the amount of trees that you have, we will move on to the next step. In a new layer with the lighter shade of the dark greens, lay down a strip of color slightly below the trees, and then taking the blend brush with it using upward brush strokes, lightly blend into the trees above to create a little bit of depth. Next, merge those two layers down, and using the blend tool with a very small brush size, blend the two layers up into the top to create the illusion of more trees. It'll help to have about 60% opacity or so, and to decrease and increase your line weight to help really give the illusion of more trees in the image. In a new layer, we're going to use that same shade of green we just used for the trees and lay a wash of green over top of all of the dark green area and then lightly blend it out. Next, you're going to merge all of the trees and the grass layer down. You're going to turn down the brightness and turn up the saturation just a little bit. So next, we're going to begin the lake. Using the dark cyan shade of blue, we're going to start sketching in the shape of the lake When you're happy with the size, you're going to take the blending brush and just lightly blend out the edges. Next, in a new layer, you're going to take the lighter of the cyan blues and lightly blend over the dark blue we just used. I'm going to turn down the brightness just a little bit and blend out the edges. And then I'm going to repeat the process on the same layer, which will help give the water a little bit more depth and texture. A helpful hint for this process will be every time you add a new layer of blue to use a slightly smaller brush and a slightly smaller blending brush with slightly lower opacity to really help create the effect of ripples in the water. So in a new layer, we're going to start taking that original shade of dark green and start sketching in a shoreline and bringing that color up front, just lightly going back and forth, creating the effect of grass. And that's why I went ahead and made that original layer a little bit darker. That way, when we added this layer, it was a little bit brighter. It really helps to create a little bit more depth in the grass. And then lightly blend out. Next, we're going to begin painting the bushes. So in the dark blue-green shade on a new layer, you will sketch in a slightly messy shape with a medium-sized brush, and then using the dark shade of green on the same layer, you're going to use the blur tool and blend those two colors together with a circular motion, which will create the base of the bush we will use for the rest of the painting. So on a new layer, you're going to make a copy of this bush. You're going to move it over to the side and turn it sideways, and then you're going to turn down the brightness. And then you're going to lightly blend the edges out into the background with a light hand. And this is where in the painting that transparencies will really start coming into play. On the same layer, you're going to use the same shade of dark green that we used for the grass and lay it over top of what we just did. And then you're going to go in and lightly blend that out. And it's all on the same layer. I'm going to also make it a little bit darker too. I want to create a little bit more opaqueness in the layer. So next we're going to duplicate this layer, flip it horizontally and move it to the other side, just like we did with the original bush. We're going to make it a little bit different, so we're going to blend those edges out again. I made this one just a little bit bigger, and then I turned the brightness down as well. So next, on a new layer, you're going to make another copy of the original bush and move it to the top, very top layer. Resize it until you're happy with the shape, and then we're going to lighten the brightness up a little bit in saturation, and we're going to hide the original bush layer so it's not in the way, so we're going to create another copy. We're going to be creating a couple of new bushes. Putting it next to the one we just created behind it, we're going to resize it a little bit and make it a little bit bigger. Turn down the color so it creates a little bit more depth and makes the bush in front pop. And turn down the saturation and then merge it down and then lightly blend out the edges. We're going to create another copy of that bush, put it in front of both of those bushes and lighten up the brightness a little bit. We're going to blend out the edges and we're going to merge all three of those bushes down to the same layer, copy and paste and flip them onto the other side of the painting. I'm going to make this side just a little bit smaller and I'm moving it a little further back, and then taking the blending brush, just lightly blend out those edges. And we have reached part 3. So definitely, if you need to pause the video and rewind, or if you need to catch up, feel free to. Or if you want to get up and stretch your legs and get a drink, we will begin part 3 in just a moment. So in a new layer on the top in the brightest shade of green, we're going to start laying down the details of the bushes. And there's going to be a lot of different opacities and a lot of duplicate layers in this section. We're basically just creating little clusters of green dots over top of the bush, and then with a light hand lightly blending them out. You're happy with your blending, I'm actually going to turn the saturation and hue down just a little bit, just to make it a little bit darker. You're going to make a copy of that layer and put it over the bush next to it, and then you're going to color drop the layer and add a couple more detail leaves and blend those out. That way it's not exactly the same as the other one. And we're just going to repeat the same process over top of the next couple of bushes. And I went ahead and added 2 more bushes into the scene. You'll definitely want to make sure the bush that is closest to the viewer is a little bit lighter. That way it stands out from the rest. Once you're happy with all of the bushes that you've created, you're going to merge all of those bushes onto the same layer, and then using the damp brush with a very low opacity and a very light hand, you're going to blend the edges of the bushes into the grass. Next, in a new layer with the brightest shade of green with about 50 to 40% opacity with a small brush, begin lightly sketching out the shape of the grass, and we're going to leave a little bit of darkness where the pathway will be laid down in a moment. Once you're happy with the amount of grass that you've laid down, with a large brush and low opacity, you're going to lightly blend those areas down. And then in a new layer, you're going to repeat the same process, making the grass just a little bit brighter and more detailed than the time before, and then just lightly blending it out. And next, in a new layer with the darker shade of what the palette considers to be yellow-orange, but it's actually beige, we'll begin sketching out the shape of the path, and you're going to want to use a really light hand, and you may have to go over this area a couple of times to really build up the color, and then you're going to lightly blend this area out. When you're happy with this blend out, you're going to use the brightness and saturation tool and turn the brightness down a little bit to make it a little bit darker, and then using the same shade of beige over top in a new layer, adding a slightly brighter detail layer of pathway over top, and then lightly blending that out. So next we're going to start painting the flowers. So in a new layer with the dark red pink shade, you're going to lay down little clusters of dots, and this is going to be done similar to the way we painted the leaves on the bushes. I used about 40% opacity to lay the color down, and you're going to lightly blend out. And then lay another layer of pink over top to create detail flowers. And then we are going to repeat that same process with the lighter of the dark pinks on the other bushes to the very far left. And then you're going to make a copy of that layer and move it over to the bush to the right, and feel free to add as much flowers or as little flowers as you'd like. So next we're going to begin painting the hot air balloon, and this took me a couple of tries to get it right, so don't feel discouraged. The easiest way to do this is using the soft airbrush. You're going to want to turn on the drawing assist and the drawing guide vertically. That is the easiest and fastest way to create it. And using the same dark red pink we used in the flowers, creating a circle and then filling it in. And then we're going to start creating the actual shape of the balloon, which is a teardrop with the end cut off. And then we're going to create the shape of the basket and create a rectangle and then cut the sides down horizontally. We just covered a lot too, and it's all happening really quickly, so if you need to catch up, definitely feel free to pause the video. You're going to add 2 little lines to connect the balloon to the basket because you definitely don't want the people that are riding in the balloon to fall out. So in a new layer, you're going to start the yellow, and this took me a couple of times to get right, but you're basically following the shape of the teardrop, and then you'll see me adjust mine a little bit to get it squared up, and then we will add the middle part, which is almost like little parentheses. Make sure to use the eraser tool if you need it. I know sometimes my hand's a little wobbly and my symmetry is a little off, so that's why the drawing assist really helps me. And fill that in, and then we're going to adjust the ends just a little bit to give it more of a round shape. We're then going to adjust the size and move it a little bit more into the top left-hand corner of the painting. And I am definitely happier now where it's at, and we will be pausing for part 4. So if you need to get up or pause the video again, definitely feel free to. You can always pause and come back to it, and when you're ready, we'll begin part 4. So in a new layer with the darkest shade of cyan blue with the soft airbrush tool, in the hard light function, we're going to sketch over our painting on both sides, the full length and part of the bottom and part of the bushes. And then with the soft airbrush in the smudge tool, you're going to lightly blend those areas out. As soon as I'm done blending, I'm also going to take the hue and saturation tool, increase the brightness just a little bit, and increase the saturation just so it's not so dark. And then in another new layer, using the soft light tool, using the damp brush again, we're going to sketch in some depth over the trees, sky, lake, and some of the bush area, and then with the soft airbrush, lightly blend those areas out. And by using these different overlay functions layered over top of each other, we can really create some unique shadows and color depth in the image without being completely stuck using only our palette. When you're happy with your blending, in a new layer, we're going to put it in the overlay function. And using the very light cyan blue over top of the whole painting, we're going to sketch in some smaller detail highlights. And you'll see me adding highlights over most of the image, really going in and pulling out the smaller details and adding areas of lightness, and it'll help create a focal point with the mountain. And when creating this layer, you'll really want to keep in mind that the light is coming from the top right hand side of the image and is only touching the tops of all of the elements we have painted. So definitely be careful not to over highlight, and then you will lightly blend out with a soft airbrush. When you're happy with your blending, I also used the Gaussian blur tool just a little bit to help further diffuse the light, and then adjusted the opacity just a little bit down. And by diffusing it out just a little bit more, that'll help preserve some of the shadows that we just created. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to go to the very top of the canvas layer menu, and we're going to do a copy canvas, and we're going to paste it over the top. Now everything we've just painted is all on the same layer to work off of. Using the damp brush and going in with about 80 to 90% opacity with the blend tool, we're going to start creating smaller brush strokes in all of the painting, kind of marrying in all of the areas together. We're going to create some detail area around all the bushes and then lightly blending over everything. And by putting it all on the same layer, we can now add details without ruining the work underneath of it. Thing we're going to do on that same layer, we're going to go up to the trees in front of the mountain and create the illusion of some lighter bushes and trees in front of the darker ones. I'm going to go in and slightly pull up some of the green from the grass in front of the water, really going in with circular shapes to create some new bushes, and I'm going to adjust the tree line just a little bit, just adding some detail and texture to the painting. And you can really go in and change the size and opacity of the brush to really get some different details in there. And definitely don't forget about the bush on the other side, because I almost did. So next, in a new layer, we're going to begin creating the beach line with the sand, and we're going to use that sandy beige color from the pathway and lightly sketch in with a small brush along the water's edge, and then lightly blend out when you're happy with the amount of sand that you have. And then on that same layer, you're going to use that light cyan blue, and we're going to start sketching in the water line. And this is a really tiny brush, and build up the layer a little bit, and we're going to drag it down to about the middle of the lake, and then we're going to lightly blend out. And this will really help to create more detailed ripples across the water. The next thing we're going to be doing is creating a new layer, and we're going to use the light pen to create some light rays, and using the lightest sandy beige color and create 5 light rays across the image. So you're going to set that layer to overlay, and then using the Gaussian blur, you're going to blur it out just a little bit. You're going to make a copy of that layer, blur that bottom layer out a little bit more, and then the first layer, that is now the top layer, turn down the opacity, and then merge those 2 layers down, and then using the Gaussian blur, blur it out just a little bit more, and that will really help to create a soft diffuse light ray throughout the image. I know the method seems a little convoluted, but definitely trust the process because the result is beautiful. Another new layer with the Bokeh light pen that's located in the luminance section, using the overlay function again and using the same shade of pink from the flowers, we're going to make it really light, and then we're going to create a layer of light flares over top of the whole image, approximately 35% to 40% size, and very lightly. And then we're going to turn up the saturation and brightness just a little bit and adjust the hue. Just like the layer before, we're going to use the Gaussian blur tool, and we're going to blur it out just a little bit. We're going to make a copy of it. The bottom layer we're going to blur out again, and then that top layer you're going to decrease the opacity a little bit, and then you're going to merge those 2 layers down, and then using the Gaussian blur again, just lightly blend it out to diffuse the light a little bit more. So definitely feel free to pause the video to catch up, because I know this was a lot. So in a new layer, the next thing we're going to do, using the overlay function, with the same yellow that we used for the hot air balloon, you're going to make it really, really light, And then we're going to, like before, sketch in some really small details with the damp brush. We're going to put some highlights over top of the water, the bushes, the trees, and the grass and background again. And then we're going to lightly blend out with the soft airbrush. Like we did before in the last layer of highlights, this will be adding the final layer of detail highlights to our image. And you will also see me in just a moment turn down the opacity just so it's not so bright. Once you're happy with your blending, you're going to go to the very top of the layer menu again and copy the canvas and paste it over the top. And just like before, we're going to add some more texture brush strokes to the piece, and I wanted to add a little bit more detail to the trees next to the mountains. Added just a little bit more texture to the bush up front, and now I'm going in and really carving out some new details. This will really help unify all of the highlights you just added again and make it look like it's part of the image and not floating on top. So the next thing I did was I added a new layer, and I'm going to use the soft light function using the damp brush and lightly sketch in with the darkest shade of green a little bit of shadow over top of the bottom of the bushes, and lightly blend with the soft airbrush and merge it down to that copy canvas layer. So the next thing we're going to be adding to the copied canvas layer again is the illusion of grass. And with about 79% or so opacity and a very small brush, you're going to create little flicks in the grass area, both in the light and dark areas. That way it creates the illusion of individual grass blades within the texture of the grass. And you'll definitely want to create some against the bushes too. That'll help unite the grass and the bush area together just a little bit better and really help to create a nice little scene. Once you're happy with how much grass you have, we're going to do another copy canvas layer and raise the saturation of the image just a little bit, just to brighten things up. So we have finally reached the end. The very last thing for us to do is to sign our painting. I am so proud of you and so happy that you've come on this journey with me. And I'm going to use the light pen to sign my name with a bright green and turn it down just a little bit so it stands out better. And we are done. We definitely covered a lot today, and I hope there are things that you learned along the way that you can apply to your own paintings. But thank you so much for joining me on this mountain spring adventure. I hope you had fun. I know I did. This is just a small piece of my painting process, and I really wanted to share my love of painting with you. If you decide to paint this painting and are on Instagram, I would absolutely love to see what you create. Please feel free to tag my Instagram at TimStarStudio. And if you like this video and want to see more art tutorials and art-related content, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video, friend. Happy painting!